BABA, which is how I say it, Build America, Buy America, is essentially the law that was enacted as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And it requires that federal financial assistance programs for infrastructure use U.S.-made iron, steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. So infrastructure includes projects with public functions such as roads, highways, bridges, electrical transmission facilities, broadband infrastructure, and buildings, and so on. So under BABA, the requirements for the categories that I mentioned are as follows. And this is where the devil is in the details for sure. But at a high level, iron and steel, all the manufacturing processes from initial melting stage through application of coatings must occur in the U.S. For manufactured products, all products must be manufactured in the U.S., and the cost of its components must be manufactured in the U.S. at greater than 55% of the total cost. So there is a little bit of a science project at times to figure out whether or not your supply chain breakdown satisfies that 55% rule. And then for construction materials, all the manufacturing process must occur in the U.S. And over time, we've received more guidance that further defines those manufacturing processes that must occur in the U.S. For example, fiber optic cable is defined actually as a construction material, and the further guidance definition tells us that the cabling, the jacketing, the stranding, and the optical fiber, those processes must occur in the U.S. And finally, in general, agencies have the authority to waive application of these BABA requirements on the following basis. If there's a domestic non-availability, if there's an unreasonable cost, or a waiver may be issued if it's in the public interest. And so each specific agency would be contacted and consulted to determine whether or not a waiver is necessary. But it's very clear within the Infrastructure Act and BABA that the intent was to reduce and issue more limited waivers. So I don't think we can expect to see broad waivers in perpetuity. And finally, I just want to point out that BABA applies to federal financial assistance award programs, and this is separate and distinct from federal procurement. You may hear BAA, which is technically the Buy American Act, which has been around since the 30s. So those rules actually govern federal procurement buying for its own use. So there is some distinction there.
Josh, misconceptions about BABA.
Sure. There's a few common ones that we've seen. One very common one is mixing up the funding source and the rules which apply to what you can buy with that funding. So we'll have people asking things like, I'm getting BABA funding. Well, no, you're not really, or things like that. So it's important to understand there are funding sources. BEAD, the Broadband Equity, Access, and Development Act, is a funding source. It is a means by which the federal government is dispersing money to states and then to network operators to build networks. There are other government funding sources for broadband. Some examples include ARPA, the American Recovery Plan Act, which has a couple of buckets of funds available, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF, Middle Mile, Tribal Broadband. So these are all funding sources that the network operator may be receiving funds from. Then there are rules which apply to that funding. BABA is a set of rules which applies to some of these government programs, notably BEAD. It is generally not retroactive, so there are programs such as the programs under ARPA to which it does not apply. So it's important to understand the funding source you are receiving from to know what rules apply to it. Again, BABA definitely applies to BEAD. So then BABA, which is one set of rules, also has these waivers. There's a waiver that applies to BEAD. So there's a slightly different set of rules that apply to BEAD funding that are different from what's in the BABA Act. Lori gave some examples there. There are other waivers to government rules. There's the potential in the future as other government funding programs come along that they'll have their own waivers. So the bottom line is you have to understand your funding source to know what rules apply. What we see a lot of is certain people within an organization know where their money's coming from, but the people they task to go out and purchase products aren't necessarily connected with that. So they'll ask questions like, I'm getting BABA funding. Well, no, you're not. Things like that. There are other government rules and restrictions. And as Brianna pointed out, there's restrictions that apply to direct government procurement. So if something's being purchased for government use. So we get questions like, do you comply with the rules for the funding that I'm getting? And we ask, where are you getting your funding from? And of course, and the person purchasing it sometimes doesn't know. And maybe it turns out it's a Department of Defense project, and the Department of Defense has its own rules. So again, make sure whoever's purchasing the product is connected with the rules applying to that. We see a few more specific misconceptions. There is a de minimis bucket, meaning there's a certain amount of spend per project, 5% or $1 million, whichever is less, that you can put into this bucket and say, this BABA rules don't have to apply to this. That's intended to be for very minor things like ties and shrink wraps and minor consumables. It doesn't mean, oh, I can buy fiber optic cable and put in this de minimis bucket and not have to worry about things like that. We see misconceptions about how it applies to fiber optic cable. The final cable construction step being done in the US is not sufficient. There are cablers who use overseas optical fiber, make a cable of it, and say, well, this is US made. Well, yes, it may be US made at the cable level, but it is not complying with BABA or with the BEAD waiver. So there's a lot of misconception of, there are some vendors out there saying US made, and they're being honest, but it's not the same as BABA or BEAD waiver compliant.
Do you have any recommendations how these service provider customers can meet this inventory control challenge? Any recommendations for them? I'm sure they will be challenged to do so. And then, sort of a part B, like an either or, if you wish to address that, or anybody on our panel who cares to share what it's like for you as a supplier of BABA compliant products in terms of your own inventory control, your own supply chain, your own procurement. I'm sure that our audience would benefit from, hearing about the systems that you have in place. And then again, any recommendations for your customers for how they can do their inventory control, I think would be a worthwhile piece of information to put across. So if I can start with Brianna, thanks for bearing with me through that long question. If you wouldn't mind addressing any part of it, I'm sure any information you have would be helpful.
Yeah, well, going back to a comment I made, some of the requests that we've seen, it may at times be easier to just have a blanket, is this compliant? Certainly, we have some products that we can easily say across the board, regardless of who the customer is, that is compliant. But we are finding, we're having to make supply chain decisions and potentially create new designs that have, different components from domestic suppliers versus components for other customers and markets where we have what I'll call a little more flexibility. So we're having some very interesting discussions with our engineering teams. They don't like the idea of having to create separate part numbers. Again, we could lock things down and say we're only going to offer to all of our customers the same design, the same supply chain options. But in some cases, we want to continue to have the option to have a BABA compliant design as opposed to it's not needed for BABA. So we're kind of wrestling through what the implications are within our engineering groups and having to track multiple part numbers, potentially that might imply multiple drawings, so from an engineering perspective, it's a big ask for them. And also within our supply chain, having multiple suppliers versus having only single sourced, that's difficult for supply chain. That could be risky potentially if you only have one domestic supplier. Sometimes that's seen as a risk that you only have a single source. So we've been bringing in a task force that has representation from our supply chain, from engineering, from our product line managers, sales, so that we're having the conversation for everybody, everyone's on the same page, and that we don't make decisions in a silo.